Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, filling in for Elliot Waldman this week. Before we get started on today's interview, just a quick reminder that you can subscribe to Trendlines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcast app of your choice, and you can find links to do so at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Also, to receive a full transcript of the interview, just email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. The history of Europe's age of exploration and empire usually follows a familiar narrative. Starting in the late 15th century, European explorers set out to find maritime trade routes to the lucrative spice and textile markets of Asia. Happening by chance upon the New World of the Americas, they quickly established colonies whose wealth, mainly in the form of gold and silver, combined with advances in military technology, propelled what would become known as the West to centuries of global dominance that has only begun to wane today. In this narrative, Africa and Africans are all but invisible, except as a tragic footnote when it comes to the history and legacy of slavery. My guest today is Howard French, whose fifth and latest book, Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, convincingly argues that almost everything about this familiar narrative is wrong. Far from being peripheral to the age of exploration, Africa was in fact the central focus of its early period. And far from being anecdotal to the wealth and power generated by Europe's colonies in the Americas, Africans were the irreplaceable producers of it. Interweaving thoroughly documented historical research with Howard's deep personal and professional experience with all the regions of the Atlantic world and Asia, Born in Blackness is the kind of book that changes the way you see both the past and the present. It will be released on October 12th, and it's already available for pre-order. Howard French is a career foreign correspondent and global affairs writer. From 1990 to 2008, he reported overseas for the New York Times, serving as bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan and the Koreas, and China. He is a member of the board of the Columbia Journalism Review and a professor at the Columbia Journalism School. His website is howardwfrench.com. His Twitter handle is @HOFrench, and his weekly WPR column appears every Wednesday. Howard, thanks so much for joining us on Trendlines.
Great to be with you, Judah.
Before we get into the substance of your great book, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the genesis of it, because as I was reading it, and from what I know of your professional background from your bio and what you talk about in the book itself, it just seemed like you couldn't have designed a better career path to write this book than what you actually lived. So I guess what I became curious of, when you knew that you had to write this book, was it something that you've known for years and you've been preparing over the course of that career path, or is it something that you were searching around for something to write and you realized, oh, this is what I could put together from what I've lived?
This is a really good question to start with, because it's one that I have never stopped wrestling with. In terms of my own processes, when I set out to write a book, a lot of it is mysterious. There's always some element of thought processes that are taking place kind of in the background. It's not an explicit notion that at an identifiable moment of time that this is the thing that I must do 3 years or 5 years from now. It's more inchoate than that. But as your question anticipates, this book project involves some pretty strong overlaps with both biographical experience of mine in terms of just my own life, and as well as professional, beyond sort of family and upbringing, professional experience. So, my parents moved our very large family to West Africa when I was entering college, and younger brothers and sisters of mine had the great benefit of living in West Africa, in and doing their early schooling in West Africa. And I began to visit the continent as a college student and sort of fell in love with the continent, and changed my life in many ways, putting me on a track to become a journalist quite unexpectedly, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the first stage, just kind of trying to understand Africa's place in the world better, not having being fairly typical in terms of my Americanness and not having very much deep prior exposure to Africa and its place in the world or history or anything else. Um, and then by further accident, a few years later, when I joined the New York Times and became a correspondent, they kept sending me to parts of the world that sort of, again, intersected with this prior experience and expanded it. You could say very largely that I became um, a a, um, a journalist of the greater Atlantic region, uh, not in one assignment, but through a series of assignments. First, I was assigned to cover the Caribbean, and then that was expanded to include Central America and the northern tier of South American countries. And then I was sent back to West Africa by the New York Times, covered West and Central Africa. Of course, I'm from the United States, so that's also at the Atlantic. Um, I speak several European languages and have spent time back and forth between the United States, Africa, and Europe. And so a kind of sense of the bigger, broader Atlantic world began to kind of come stitched together in my mind, not through any explicit kind of project. The best answer I can probably give to your direct answer to your question is that oddly, this um, the explicit nugget of this book idea came together probably most directly a long time ago in East Asia, which has nothing to do in any obvious way with the book. I spent almost 12 years divided between residence in Japan and then China, uh, and also covering Korea or the Koreas and traveling more widely in Asia. And there are these pregnant questions that are unavoidable through when one works, especially as a journalist in East Asia, about why the West surpassed um, Asia in the sort of conventional estimate of economists and historians at a certain moment of time. What was this all about? How much of this was predetermined? What was it due to? How much of it is likely to continue, et cetera, et cetera? And so these thoughts kind of got me thinking in a more explicit way than I think I had done before about what was it that got the West going, and to come at it again via my own, again, career and biographical experience.
We're going to dial in on a lot of the detail in the book, which is extremely detailed. That's one of the things that's one of the biggest impressions that I got from it was how much really is packed in there. But just to offer sort of a synopsis of what the book's about, what the central thesis is, and why it matters, maybe.
This is something that I think writers of big sprawling histories are loath to do, but because we're friends, I'm going to do my best. um, so the key notion that underpins everything in the book is that there's this period um, in the 15th century that is generally overlooked and unaccounted for, um, in which Africa plays a central role in the um, thrust by European countries, especially by the two main Iberian powers of the time, Castile, which then becomes Spain, and Portugal, to um, sort of in the conventional shorthand, explore the world. Explore later becomes conquer and colonize, but it begins with exploration. And the most conventional story about this is that this was almost entirely about finding a route to the east, meaning to Asia, which comes under various interpretations. India, but also the Far East, so China, with an idea that there were great civilizations there and great wealth there, and because of the Ottomans controlling the terrestrial routes to the east, the Europeans were hell-bent on finding a way around that and connecting trade routes via the sea. The conventional stories are I think, uh, um, irrevocably flawed because they omit a few things that are essential to my story, and I think also essential to understanding where we sit today, what the world has become, uh, and that is that um, uh, not to say there was no interest in discovering a sea route to the east, but that these Europeans were, in fact, in the first instance, obsessed with finding something altogether different. And the something altogether different that they were obsessed with finding, and this is incontrovertible if one begins to peruse the historical record of the sort of early and middle decades of the 15th century, are sources of African gold that were known to exist south of the Sahara. And this is what propelled the Iberians, and in the first instance, the Portuguese. Portugal was at the time an almost new nation, and was a very weak and poor nation. It was looking to um, this was a bid to strike it rich and to be able to secure itself against covetous Spain and to assure its continued existence. Um, and so the most famous person who incarnates all of this is this figure, Prince Henry the Navigator. Um, and Henry, in the 1430s, begins to finance a bunch of seafaring voyages further and further down the coast of Africa in the search of gold. The European awareness of African gold south of the Sahara comes from via two means. One of them is practical, and that is uh, African gold had been a major source of gold for Europe via a trans-Saharan trade that came to most European countries through Italian lands for a long time already. So it was known that there was gold somewhere down there. But this sort of becomes a concrete thing in the minds of people in the sort of early to mid 15th century, like Henry the Navigator, because of a very famous map called the Catalan Atlas, which is a portion of which forms the image on the cover of my book, in which one finds depicted an ostensibly very powerful and surely very, very rich African king named Mansa Musa, sitting in the middle of what is now known as the Sahel, greeting a, a, a trader or envoy from North Africa. And Mansa Musa is dressed in a kind of regal European mode, on a throne with a scepter, holding an orb of solid gold. Um, and for the Iberians of this time, and especially the Portuguese, this sort of becomes a matter of obsession. Okay, so some map maker in Mallorca, uh, using intelligence from travelers who had, we believe, crossed the Sahara and traded across the Sahara by overland, has now affirmed the existence of all of this gold. Now, of course, there's prior history. We won't go into it in great depth here, but um, in the previous century, this ruler, Mansa Musa, had actually visited Cairo on his way to Mecca on a pilgrimage, and had um, uh, uh, distributed in various ways an untold amount of gold as gifts and as tribute and as various other displays of power and generosity, all in Cairo and all along his route, to such an extent that the price of gold was depressed in a very wide region of the Mediterranean world for at least a decade. Right. So all of these things come together to um, drive this interest in sub-Saharan Africa, and to propel or to impel Henry the Navigator, and then after him, the next few Portuguese sovereigns in the pursuit of of wealth in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, that story is essentially cut out of our normal kind of beginning in grade school, but even in the academy narrative of the Age of Discovery. The Age of Discovery begins with not Asian spices per se, or silks or whatnot, but a yearning to connect with a legendarily rich and powerful figure black figure, who exists somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, who controls these kind of pharaonic quantities of gold. And so this is important because, as I say in the very first page, I think, of my book, a story that begins in the wrong place is unlikely to be a story that ends in the right place. And so the story of modernity that we usually tell begins with this quest for connections with India or China and tea and spices and things like that, silks. But that's actually not where any of this began. And the second piece of this story that I promised to tell you is that so the proof of concept was realized, the concept being the existence of huge amounts of gold in sub-Saharan Africa, the arrival of the ship of a minor Portuguese noble named Fernão Gomes, who, under contract with the Portuguese king, is exploring down the coast of West Africa further and further with each successive journey. And he arrives in the country we nowadays know as Ghana, and discovers truly ordinary people walking around with vast amounts of gold jewelry on them. And this becomes kind of the living evidence that this notion that there must be abundant sources of gold in sub-Saharan Africa is true. The Portuguese then proceed to build a fort, which I visit and speak about repeatedly in my book, at a place called Elmina, which means the mine. And this fort is commerce with this fort becomes the Portuguese priority for the next 3 decades. Not all, but a great many of the greatest names in European navigation of that era are put to work in the service of this fort, including Columbus. Sailing back and forth between Portugal and West Africa to convey the gold, to build the fort, to provide supplies, to further explore along the West African coast. And so this begins in 1471 with the discovery of Elmina. It is only in 2 decades later that Bartolomeu Dias, another Portuguese explorer, by the way, who had worked at Elmina previously, quote unquote, discovers the Indian Ocean. In other words, he goes far enough down the African coast so that he surpasses the Cape of Good Hope and enters into the waters we now recognize as the Indian Ocean. But the Portuguese business in West and Central Africa was already so great that between 1488, which is when Diaz discovers the Indian Ocean, and 1501, when Vasco da Gama finally goes to India, the Portuguese weren't even trying to go to the east. They were entirely busy and wrapped up with trying to forge civilizational and commercial ties with Africa. And the word civilization is important here because the conventional story about how this all begins kind of omits not only the notion that there was wealth in Africa, but also the notion that there was anything worthy of thinking about in civilizational terms.
That's the next thing that I wanted to talk about, because throughout the book, you really fill in the blanks and the missing pieces of a lot of the sort of conventional wisdom or conventional history about how this history unfolded. And one of the ones that I think is most important is this is that Africa wasn't empty. It wasn't an undeveloped continent where the Europeans just walked in, and certainly didn't walk in and dominate or conquer, which is sort of the method that I think popularly is most associated mainly from the Americas. But to begin with, that's not the case in West Africa, especially. There's state development, there's state capacity, there's geopolitics, and there's something else really important at play, which is the sort of the disease vectors that play a major role. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? Just what the Europeans find when they start trading with Africa, and why it is that for the next 150, 200 years at least, they're really relying most, or even longer actually, they're relying much more on diplomacy than they are on conquering or warfare.
So the Portuguese set out under Henry the Navigator down with these missions down the West African coast, and Portugal. It is important to keep remembering, was not just, as I said earlier, a relatively new European nation, or young European nation, but also a very weak European nation, small in size and not rich. And so that conditioned what sorts of means it had at its disposal, right? Henry the Navigator from the beginning was obsessed with finding this African gold, but he couldn't devote unlimited resources to these exploration missions. They had to be financed somehow. And so he sets out down the West African coast. He gets past what is now Morocco and then into what is now Western Sahara and Mauritania. And his men come, onto the land, and they try to make contacts looking for gold. There had been rumored sources of gold even in that shoulder of West Africa. They don't really find any gold worthy of mention. But what they do find is that they can kidnap and capture uh, small numbers of in the beginning, small numbers of unfortunate West African people who they sort of fall upon, right? And so they begin bringing these individuals back to Portugal, and this constitutes the beginning of what becomes quite an important and also almost entirely overlooked slave market within Europe. By the 16th century, as I learned in the research of this book, I had never known this previously, and as I write about, some of the great cities of Southern Europe had as many as 10%, their populations as many as 10% African. Places like Lisbon itself and Seville in Spain. And these African populations were mostly consisted of slaves. There were some freed people as well, but this lively slave market develops. That part of Europe in particular, but Europe in general, is desperate for manpower because of the lingering effects of the plague. And so, the Henry the Navigator's ships they're not finding the gold that they were setting out for, but they are finding that they can capture unfortunate Africans who they surprise in the countryside, and a practice of raiding begins to set in. Raiding is pretty dangerous, though, as they quickly discovered. They could make a lot of profit selling these individuals back in Europe. This helped Henry finance his gold exploration missions, but Europeans were getting killed. The Africans are not just completely hapless, waiting to be carried off. They in various places fought back, and they used, there was local intelligence networks. If you raid a village 10 miles from here, by the time you get 10 miles further down the road, well, given the nature of transportation in that area, word of mouth may have already reached 10 miles down the road. And so the villagers are actually looking out for these strange white people and ready to defend themselves and not as easily surprised. And so on the one hand, raiding begins to fall out of favor by the middle of the 15th century because the Africans are sort of wise to it and are prepared in consequence. And that their European technological advantage, such as it existed, was very small. The Portuguese would come ashore in armor, which might seem like a great idea if you're going into battle against European forces. But in tropical Africa, that's not such a great idea. And you can't run very fast and you get very overheated pretty quickly. And so the Africans were able to devise certain defensive strategies that allowed them to defend themselves pretty well. The Europeans had guns already by that time, but the guns were very limited use. They were mostly for kind of theatrical purposes. They're not accurate. They couldn't be reloaded quickly. And if you were entirely dependent on a gun, well, a spear or a knife or a bow and arrow, all of which were used to great effect by African populations, as were fleets of dugout canoes to come out and sort of meet the Europeans in the water even before they came ashore. You're going to be in trouble, right? And so by the time the Portuguese come to the place we now know of as Senegal, they were beginning to have doubts about this raid for slave trade approach. And as it happens, they encountered a kingdom in Senegal that was a satellite of the Mali Empire. Mali is the place from which Mansa Musa, the famously rich king and the person who controlled the biggest amounts of gold in West Africa, came from. To Mali's west in Senegal was a satellite kingdom, very highly developed in terms of governmental structures. And the Portuguese began to treat with the king of a man named Bumi Jalin in a kind of normal political discourse, a diplomatic discourse. Jalin was happy to speak with them, and the Portuguese explained what they wanted. They said, "We're looking for gold." It was obvious to them that because governance was so well organized in this place, they stood no chance in terms of raiding them. Jalin told them, "Well, there's this place called Mali, a few hundred miles to the east, that I'm a tributary of. They have lots of gold." So that notion already gets confirmed in the Portuguese mind. And so this is a kind of pivotal moment in which a shift begins to take place away from a military approach to slavery and to commerce toward a diplomatic, sort of standard diplomatic political approach. And this continues all the way down the coast. Now, I have to interject a word of caution. We're speaking of Africa, and it's always useful to remember that Africa is the world's second largest continent, right? After Asia, geographically speaking. And you can't speak about political development today in Africa as being a uniform thing. And you can also not speak about political development in Africa in the 15th century as a uniform thing. In Senegal, they had a highly developed kingdom. By the way, that king went to Portugal on a visit and stayed for some time in Portugal and enjoyed formal state-to-state relations with Portugal. Things like this are never taught, right? Um, uh, uh, um, but other parts of the West African coast had varying other degrees of political development, not all of which were as highly sophisticated or elaborate as what the Portuguese encountered in Senegal. The key here is a couple of things happened. The Portuguese understood that they didn't enjoy a vast technological or military advantage, especially given the numbers that they could project in any West African environment. And therefore, most of the time, finding states that were reasonably well developed and had strong governance structures that they could treat with was a much better approach for them in terms of seeking gold and even trading for slaves than this raiding approach had been.
And then I guess the other aspect is the difference in who was vulnerable to which diseases. in terms of the Europeans in Africa, and then subsequently the Europeans in the Americas, and we'll get to the major implications of the depopulation of the Americas through the spread of European diseases. But in Africa, it's a different story.
This notion of, which was central to your last question about when did the Europeans abandon this sort of conquest-based approach to Africa, which, as you said, they didn't return to for another couple of hundred years, was due in part to epidemiology. The Europeans, Portugal was tiny, probably 1 million people in the 15th century. Spain was several times bigger, but still not huge. The amount of the sort of numbers of in terms of manpower that they could invest in missions like this was from the outset somewhat limited, right? It costs a lot of money also to build ships. So until you begin to discover large amounts of gold, which the Portuguese did first in 1471, this was an exorbitant kind of pursuit, right? But it was also exorbitant in terms of manpower, in terms of life mortality rates. The Portuguese and the Spanish and subsequently others, all the way until the late 18th, early 19th century, were dying in sort of huge numbers from tropical diseases, most of which they had never encountered. Now, there was malaria in Europe, but the type of malaria that existed in West Africa was different and much more dangerous. But there were any number of other diseases that caused Europeans to die in vast numbers in West and Central Africa. And so this limited the ability of Europeans to project force, to pursue conquest, to hold territory, and to become imperial in the sense that we understand the word in a West African environment or in an African environment. Which turn almost entirely when the Europeans arrive in the New World. This is a better known story among the sort of general public, that Native American populations, whether they were in South America or in North America, lacked immune resistance to an extraordinary number of common European diseases. Even the common cold was lethal in the first generation or two to Native American populations who were exposed to it. And so the epidemiological tables turn very dramatically in the Europeans' favor when they begin to explore and very quickly thereafter seek conquest in the American environment. Brazil is discovered by the Portuguese in 1501, and it was a great source of mystery to the Europeans. Why are these people? Why are they dying so much? They didn't understand it. They had been used to dying at nearly those kinds of rates themselves in an African environment.
When it's at this point, it's a gradual, obviously, transition, and you really portray it in the book in a way that that's almost indelible on reading it. But when you add in this component of the Americas that are very quickly, in a sense, depopulated, it coincides with the transition or the experimentation with a plantation approach to first sugar. We can start there. And all of a sudden, in Africa, the European obsession becomes less and less about gold, and more about finding ways to actually have people work these plantations that they're developing. And I feel like this is really the crux of where your argument about the centrality of Africa to the production and the emergence of modernity really starts kicking in with this networked Atlantic world, as you call it. So I guess before we dive into that, it's a problematic term, it's a highly debated term, but for your working argument in terms of the book, how are you thinking about and defining modernity in the context of what you then write about?
I don't spend a lot of time, despite the fact that modern world is in the title of my book, sort of expatiating on the definitions of modernity. This is, uh, an academic term that can produce endless argument and debate. Just as a functional definition for our conversation, I would say it is the end of traditional lifestyles in which people were closely rooted to their places of origin and to a kind of stable way of living that evolves slowly over many generations, and suddenly become aware that the world is a large, and this seems like you know, it's tempting to think of this as a new concept, but this concept begins in the 15th century. The world is a highly interconnect or increasingly interconnected place, and how we think about ourselves back then becomes increasingly defined by contact with others, and the contact with others involves um, notions of discovery, such as it hadn't really existed before, but also the transference of influence. That people begin to understand that there are practices that exist in this place which might be, and not in our place, but they may be relevant to our problems. Um, and so modernity means a kind of, in the way I'm using the term, in the first instance, a kind of um, unmooring of people from narrow, sort of tightly circumscribed locality and from the traditions that adhere to, you know, that sort of lifestyle. And the Portuguese are the first really to kind of engage in this as they first set out into Africa, but then more broadly in the New World. And the Spanish very quickly follow. And then suddenly, um, uh, nothing is as it has been before. So you see already in the early 16th century, you see bronzes from Benin, which is actually, Benin's a confusing word. There's a modern nation named Benin, but the place we're talking about when we speak of Benin bronzes is a region of present-day Nigeria and a very powerful kingdom in the sort of early modern era. You see bronze work from Benin in the early 16th century that demonstrates this um, way that modernity has very quickly come to impact everyone in this new, highly integrated world, where the 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 African artisans who make these bronze uh, lost wax sculptures and sheets of hammered and molded bronze depict in a sort of almost caricatured way the Portuguese. They're expressing a bemused curiosity about these strangers. And so what this tells us is not just that the Africans were aware of the existence of different people in another part of the world who they had never previously come into contact with, but it begins to inform, and this is what modernity does, their own sense of themselves in new ways. So when you have a new other, you begin to have a new self. Um, and as the world comes together under this regime of modernity, that's what happened to all of us. Everyone begins to exist in a kind of relativistic bath of connection and identity, much more fluid.
One of the things that made a big impression on me was the degree to which Africa is not a passive actor in this emergence of the modern world. You write about the way in which Asian textiles that are traded by the Europeans are highly prized, but also at one point the way in which African nations leverage some of the rivalries within Europe to their own advantage, or seek to shift alliances to favor themselves in relation to a trading relationship that had grown disadvantageous, particularly when it comes to the explosion of the slave trade. So talk a little bit about that, the ways in which African nations were actors, what they were confronted with, how they were trying to navigate, and what they were dealing with in this emergence of this networked Atlantic world.
In the sort of beginning of the slave trade, or near the beginning of the slave trade, the Portuguese come to discover that what you've just put your finger on very quickly. This agency among local African polities. That the Portuguese want to come and trade for gold, and then very quickly thereafter want to trade for slaves. And they discover that the Africans are not willing to accept just any old Portuguese goods that the Portuguese happen to have aboard their ships, right? And Portugal, I keep belaboring this, was not a rich country. It was not, by European standards at the time, a particularly advanced country, or didn't have a particularly advanced economy. And so the Africans quickly in various places, made the Portuguese understand that if they wish to do commerce with uh, local peoples in West Africa, they'll have to find better goods. And so this is an important part of the story, another, coming at your modernity question from another direction, it's an important part of the story of how the ball of modernity gets rolling. The Portuguese are desperate to get African gold, and then thereafter African slaves. The Portuguese don't have much beyond wine, dried fish, very poor textiles, olives, and the like, right? And the Africans don't really need much of that. And so the Portuguese are obliged, in order to sustain and expand their commerce, to increase their trade with other parts of Europe, so that they can acquire the goods from other parts of Europe that the Africans might wish in exchange for the Africans' goods. And so the Portuguese then begin to buy things from the Low Countries and from Germany, especially refined metals, iron and bronze and the like, which were coveted in many parts of West Africa, and then subsequently also textiles from various places. The next phase of this comes so after Da Gama reaches India, and the sort of legendary Asian trade becomes integrated into the European commercial portfolio. The Portuguese come to understand, well, actually, European textiles had only relatively modest appeal in West African markets. The Portuguese discovered that the Africans, for the most part, are highly enamored of these Asian textiles. And so in the first instance, you have with this famous, almost cliched phrase of triangular trade, right? But what we discover, though, when we look at this history carefully, is how Europe's connection with Africa creates a series of triangular trades. The first triangular trade involves two legs of the triangle in Europe itself, meaning Portugal had to trade with Northern Europe to get goods that the Africans wanted, which it then took to Africa to get goods from Africa to bring back to Europe. Okay, the next phase of it is the Portuguese discover, after they establish trade with India, and then beyond India further on into the east, that Indian textiles are highly prized in many African markets. And so this is the second triangular trade, and neither of these so far mentioned triangular trades ever really get mentioned in our conventional accounts of how this all unfolded. But the point that relates to your question is that the Africans were not just sort of sitting there helpless, with no options, available to them, and just obliged to take whatever it is that the Europeans wanted to sell them. In fact, as I detail in my book, in various parts of Africa, Benin is a very good example of this. The textiles were more advanced than the textiles of Europe. And so the Europeans came with these heavy things that, heavy woolens, or, cotton was not widely available yet in Western Europe, certainly as a crop. And so they come with these goods that are ill-suited to the local market, and the people in places like Benin say, well, what do you want us to do with that? If you want to buy slaves from us, or if you want to buy gold from us. Benin wasn't selling gold at the time, but other nearby states were. You'll have to do better than that. And so this whole question of agency, or of what it is that the Africans saw in the relationship, gets sort of cut out in a kind of pasteurization of the narrative that we're used to telling ourselves.
And then we do get to the more widely known triangle trade, and it takes up a good part of the book because of how important it is to the evolution both of Europe, of Africa, of the Americas, and maybe starts to get at an initial answer to that question you mentioned at the outset that sort of seems to obsess or be an obsession in East Asia, of how Europe makes this qualitative jump to having more power at its disposal. And this is obviously the use of slave labor in a plantation economy, starting with sugar and then later cotton, but predominantly sugar. And correct me if I'm wrong, but your book supports a thesis that emerges maybe 30, 40 years ago, that sugar and the plantation economy is central to the rise to global dominance in terms of power of Europe, and that it just has a dramatic impact on everything. And you go through a bunch of things that I'll turn it over to you to talk about, and then anything that you might leave out, I'll mention afterwards, because there's such a stunning range of impacts and developments that come just from the growth of sugar in a plantation economy in the Americas using slave labor that derives from that, from the economy to the culture to the diet to you name it. So I'll turn it over to you. What role does this play, this transition to the plantation economy, growing sugar in the Americas using enslaved Africans as labor?
So in these lost decades that I spoke about in the very beginning of our conversation, that get cut out of the story of the age of exploration, 3 decades during which the Portuguese were entirely wrapped up in seeing how far they could get with Africa in terms of economic and political relations. Elmina becomes the center of this new world for them, but the Portuguese very quickly, because they see so much promise in Africa, begin exploring much more widely. Not as the story would have it, just looking for a route to Asia, but actually looking for ways to connect much more deeply with Africa, which had so far turned out so profitable for them. And two really important things happened in pretty quick succession. 2-3 years after Elmina, the trade in gold is established in Elmina, the Portuguese discover the island of Sao Tome, which is in the sort of there's for listeners who are not terribly familiar with the geography of Africa, it's kind of I call it inelegantly, the underarm of Africa. You have this bulge of West Africa, and then the coastline of Africa plunges almost due south, all the way to South Africa. Well, Sao Tome is offshore, right where the continent's coastline negotiates that curve from east-west, now suddenly southwards. Sao Tome had a few geographic particularities to it that made it sort of historically special and fortuitous for Portugal. First of all, it was uninhabited. Secondly, it had very rich volcanic soil. So uninhabited means they don't have to conquer it. They can just walk on shore and do whatever they want. Very rich volcanic soils. It's a mountainous island. with plentiful rainfall, volcanic soils, and then finally it's close to the African coastline, close enough so that you can uh, negotiate pretty quick voyages back and forth by sea. And so the Portuguese first begin to establish a slave trade uh, from using Sao Tome as a base to acquire slaves from the Central African coast, from places like present-day Gabon, present-day Congo, etc., um, to Ghana, to Elmina. They come to understand that they can expand the gold trade with Elmina, which was supplying perhaps a tenth of the known world supply of gold at the time. This one single place, right? That they can expand this gold trade if they can provide more manpower to the local sovereigns. The Ghanaians were willing to buy slaves from other parts of Africa in order to profit more from this trade. I think actually before we come to the sugar question, it's worth pausing here for a second. I think people hearing this in the present may be intrigued and horrified. And the horror part I can't help, it's normal, but intrigued by this thought that why would Africans buy and sell other Africans? This is kind of seems like an insurmountable paradox, like we just get stuck on this thought, right? The people in Elmina and surrounding area of what we now know as Ghana did not see the people they were buying as Africans. There was no such thing to them as Africans. They were foreigners. They were aliens. They were people from another part of the continent who did not speak their language, who did not share their immediate culture, and therefore did not seem to be um, uh, worthy of consideration on the same basis as their fellow uh, countrymen, right? There was no identity yet of Africans as such, right? And so it's on this basis that the slave trade begins to be established.
If I can jump in, you also point out in the book that even if slavery had been used or a part of cultures in that region of Africa, the approach to enslavement was quite different, and that many perhaps the African polities that are trading in slaves could not have imagined, or at least initially could not have imagined, the kind of life that they were condemning these people to and selling them to Europeans, because the way in which they practiced slavery was different as well.
Sure. So we are on the cusp of your original question about the birth of sugar and plantation society and what this all meant for Europe, which occupies so much of my book. We're on the cusp of the development of chattel slavery in a transatlantic sense, right? It hasn't really taken off yet. The Americas have just been, South America has just been discovered by the Portuguese. They haven't just figured out how to put it to use yet, right? They have seen that the Africans, meaning the people of Elmina, will buy slaves from them, and they set themselves up on Sao Tome to traffic in slaves that they purchase on the Central African coast and then bring them to West Africa for sale at Elmina, right? That we have every reason to believe, as horrifying as the idea of Africans buying and selling other Africans as slaves, that the slaves bought at Elmina, although they were put to work digging mines and working as porters, were not treated in the same sense as chattel slaves were treated in the New World. In other words, some of them were eligible for marriage into sort of normal Ghanaian society. The word Ghana didn't exist yet, by the way, not for that geography, but for simplicity's sake, I'm calling it Ghanaian society, right? That in actually the most common setup throughout West and Central Africa at the time was that slavery was not an insurmountable social taint that followed you through generations. People were able to marry into families, and their past as slaves begins to sort of fade and lose all meaning in successive generations. So this is totally distinct from chattel slavery. So that's the first thing. The people of Elmina were probably not treating the slaves that they bought as chattel. The second thing is that the people of, transatlantic slavery was just being born in this moment. The people of Elmina and the people of Congo who were selling these slaves and the people of other parts of Africa who were selling slaves to the Portuguese had no idea what sorts of fates and fortunes awaited the people that they were selling to the Portuguese in the New World. They had no idea of the New World. They had no idea of plantation slavery. They had so this isn't to make an excuse for what nonetheless seems horrible to the modern mind of selling people into slavery, but they were not they had none of the picture that fully informs our horror of that notion, right? Um, um, they didn't know that there was a place called Africa. Um, they just knew that there were societies within communicable distance of themselves with which they were familiar, and that there was a world beyond with which they were not familiar, right? And that's how people in the pre-modern era were everywhere in the world. That's what pre-modern meant, in effect. Anyway, so Sao Tome gets settled by the Portuguese. The Portuguese begin to trade for slaves in places like Congo, nearby, by the way. Congo was a very, I talk, as you know, at great length about Congo in my book. Congo was a very sophisticated polity in Central Africa. Um, uh, and the Portuguese, because they sell slaves to Ghana, they begin to kind of this idea of slavery as a, um, of human beings as a type of commerce begins to sort of gain greater purchase with the Portuguese. On Sao Tome, they begin putting some of these slaves to work. In the immediate preceding decades, Portugal had begun investing in sugar cultivation in places like Madeira and the Canary Islands. The Portuguese begin to grow sugar in Sao Tome, and Sao Tome, for reasons of geographical and historical accident, then takes off in ways that were probably unimaginable to the Portuguese. The soil was just right, the irrigation was just right, the labor supply via slavery was just right, and this little tiny place called Sao Tome very quickly becomes the leading producer of sugar in the world. Sugar in the first decades of the 1500s was a luxury good. Sugar, refined white sugar, was a specialty item in Europe reserved mostly for royals and for the very rich, and therefore was an extremely lucrative market. And so it is in this setting that the plantation, the chattel slavery-based plantation model that begins to condition the next 500 years of world history takes shape. And just in the interest of time, to fast forward a little bit, I've told you, so this is in the 1530s that sugar really takes off in Sao Tome. Brazil gets discovered, as I've said, by the Portuguese in 1501. The Portuguese didn't really know what to do with Brazil before Sao Tome. Brazil seemed like a poor place to them. The native people died. They couldn't put them to work. There was no gold there. There were a few dye woods and not much else in the Brazilian sense of things. Well, when plantations came together in Sao Tome, the Portuguese put one and one together and said, "This thing that we can do so well in little Sao Tome, imagine if we did it in Brazil." And by the way, Brazil is at just the right latitude for the straightest, quickest shot across the Atlantic, with the exact same climate as in Sao Tome, with almost, you know, from the perspective of the era, an unlimited amount of land. Uh, let's go do this in Brazil. And so the plantation model then shifts from Sao Tome, where it takes full sort of mature shape, to Brazil. And Brazil then, beginning in the um, second to third quarter of the 16th century, for the next 75 years, becomes the world's superpower of sugar, to Portugal's great benefit. And then, various other things happen. What we see repeatedly in these cycles of history is that when one European country makes a big breakthrough in the acquisition or production of wealth, other European countries quickly begin to emulate it. So when the Portuguese discover gold in Elmina, the Spanish try to come discover gold to fight for and they have these naval battles off of Elmina that nobody ever hears about. Immense flotillas of ships are fighting for African gold at Elmina. The Portuguese, although much smaller than Spain, prevailed somehow, right? So now sugar has taken off in Sao Tome and is working fantastically there, gets transferred to Brazil and starts, takes off and begins making unheard of amounts of money, more even than the 1/10 of the gold supply of the world that Portugal had acquired in Elmina. And the English say, we have to do this. And so this becomes the beginning of England's imperial age. England had been relegated to the minor islands of the Caribbean because Spain controlled the big islands. And so England says, we'll do this sugar thing in a place called Barbados. And Barbados then becomes the successor to Brazil. It doesn't wipe Brazil out of the sugar game, but it surpasses Brazil. And this becomes a kind of a big and mostly overlooked motor of England's rise in the decades that follow.
And then I want to get next to Haiti, which is obviously France's version and response to this what's become a competition among the European powers. Just to go through some of the things that I noted from the book that jumped out at me that you explain in detail about the impact of sugar and plantation, the plantation system. Sugar helps in the emergence of a public sphere in Europe because it makes beverages like coffee or hot chocolate more drinkable, and therefore you have public spaces like coffee shops that then need newspapers to sort of keep people or provide people something to talk about in common. The emergence of a powerful commercial class among the growers and plantation owners, who then create a competition with the monarchies for power that one can then trace into the emergence of democracy or Western democracies. And then the other thing that jumped out at me was the way in which, and this is again one of the points in the book where there's an equal measure of intrigue and horror, but the way in which the management of slave labor in the plantations creates the early or is the early precursor of the modern capitalist management method, essentially. So you have, you trace in the book not just the way in which sugar and the plantation economy in the Americas with African slaves or slave labor from Africa creates power in European countries, but that it just changes the way in which an individual European is living in this period. The diet, in terms of a higher caloric intake and therefore more potential to work in the Industrial Revolution, primitive factories and things like that. So all of this, it's a across the board whole of society impact from this introduction of the sugar, the cultivation of plantation sugar.
So sugar was the killer app of the modern age, in my telling. And we had in the 20th century a great historian of this phenomenon named Eric Williams, who was a student at Oxford in the 30s and much later the Prime Minister of Trinidad, who wrote his thesis in the 40s about how sugar had been responsible essentially for the Industrial Revolution, that wealth from sugar had lifted England or placed it onto a trajectory that allowed it to surpass the rest of Europe in terms of economic development and the rest of the world ultimately. And that wealth from sugar had, in fact, been the main driver of industrialization. Um, uh, Eric Williams' writings kicked off an enormous storm of controversy. First of all, the idea that a black guy from Trinidad could be saying such things in the 1930s and 40s, I think, shocked the British establishment and academics in the North Atlantic, meaning including not just Europe but the United States, were not really ready to hear or to entertain such things. And so the next few decades saw a big backlash against Eric Williams. And as what one would expect with any ideological backlash, they focused on the weaknesses in his argument without sort of allowing for the possible strengths or truths in his argument. And of course, like anyone, Eric Williams made mistakes. One of his mistakes was to say too directly that it was um, capital surpluses generated by sugar that directly led to industrialization. That's almost certainly not really true. That industrialization, the story of industrialization was both financially and culturally much more complicated than that, right? However, Eric Williams's critics made the mistake of um, going too far in their determination to sort of nullify uh, a point of view that sought to um, validate the role of Africans and people of African descent in this narrative of how we arrived at modernity. They kind of systematically excluded all consideration of of things for which we have a fairly strong amount of evidence, right? Um, and these are things that I focus on in my book. So, on the one hand, there are many economic ways in which sugar propelled British development, even if it wasn't a one-to-one sort of thing that one can trace industrialization to, right? Sugar was an enormous source of wealth for Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. Already, after less than 50 years of development of sugar in Barbados, that small island, Barbados is, I think I've written somewhere in my book, and this could be off by a little bit, but not too much. Barbados is basically the size of Long Island, right? For an American listener, right? This little tiny place had produced via sugar, after 50 years of sugar, more profit for England than all of the metals exported from the Americas by Spain. Now, the story of the metals exported from the Americas by Spain is a famous and very well-known one, right? We all know this legend of the Spanish galleons carrying immense stores of gold and silver from Mexico and from Bolivia and Peru and various other places, right? And we have no problem accepting the notion, or at least North Atlantic historians have no problem accepting the notion, that gold and silver from the Americas was a very important part of the economic story of the rise of Spain in that era. So if it is true that sugar from Barbados produced more profit than the gold and silver from all of Spanish America did for Spain, why should it be so difficult to think that in strictly, sort of narrowly speaking, economic terms, sugar was a very important thing for Britain, for what became Britain? Okay, so step number two in this line of thought. Jamaica becomes bigger in sugar than Barbados had been. Britain owned, so to speak, controlled, operated the sugar economy in Jamaica. Britain also, of course, operated sugar economies in a number of other Caribbean islands, right? Um, we talked about this emulation effect in the history of European uh, uh, imperialism. The French, seeing what is happening with sugar in the British West Indies, then determine become determined to get in on the game and take over eventually this place they called Saint-Domingue, which is the previous name for Haiti prior to the Haitian Revolution, right? The French story of sugar, so the British story of sugar in Barbados begins really in the 1630s or thereabouts, right? The French story of sugar the British had 100-year head start in sugar over the French. The French sugar for France in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue, doesn't really begin to take off seriously until the 1730s, and accelerates rapidly through the 18th century to the point where, on the eve of the Haitian Revolution, the Haiti, Saint-Domingue, was producing 40% of that one place, 40% of all the sugar in the world, and 60% of all the coffee in the world. Okay, Saint-Domingue was making more money for France than all of the British islands were making for Britain by that point in history. Okay, so I give you this sort of preamble just to deal with the economics, qua-economics part of the Eric Williams debate. Yes, you can say, perhaps, we can make a technical argument which says, perhaps, that sugar did not drive in any one-to-one sense, economically speaking, the capital formation that was, led to industrialization. Let's just put that debate to the side for the moment, right? And agree that whatever happened in terms of capital formation and industrialization, sugar was enormously important to places like Britain and France. Enormously important. Okay. The second part of your question, though, the part that interests me even more, and on which I dwell at great length in the book, has been completely unexplored by the critics of Eric Williams. And these are the social changes and political changes that this new wealth acquisition via sugar drove in Europe, and especially in Britain. These start with the diet, which is a cultural kind of change. The English work life was characterized by sloth and torpor, not because English people were lazy or sloppy or good for nothing, but because they didn't have clean water to drink. And therefore, during their working hours, they drank ale. Ale was safe to drink. Dirty drinking water was not safe to drink. And so a lot of people drank ale during their working hours, which limited their productivity and it led to all other sorts of undesirable side effects, right? The arrival in the 1630s of coffee in the British cultural milieu via slavery. Coffee was cultivated by slaves, and the sugar that made coffee drinkable to the European palate was also, as we all obviously know by now, was also produced by slaves. This creates a workplace revolution in Britain. It's still England, by the way, in the 1630s, whereby people are suddenly drinking stimulants that are sterile, pose no disease threat to them, increase their alertness, allow them to work longer days, and to do so at much greater productivity. By the way, as they're drinking these stimulants, because they're adding sugar, probably in copious amounts to these stimulating drinks, they are also getting cheap calories, which are also providing them stores of energy, which allow them to do all of the things I've just described in terms of increased productivity. And so you begin to see a productivity revolution and a work culture revolution in England beginning in the mid decades of the 17th century that provides an important kind of cultural and biological background to the takeoff of England that has been almost totally ignored by the William skeptics types, right? You've put your finger on a couple of other pieces of this large cultural argument that I've constructed in the book. I'm not going to go into them at too great a length here, except to say, sort of to retrace some of the ground that you've covered, and that is to say that in the 1630s, with the arrival of coffee shops in England, um, again via slavery, you begin to see a political revolution in England. The political revolution consists of the creation of this thing called the public sphere, whereby people sitting in coffee houses, having consuming stimulants, also tobacco by that time, by the way, which is a stimulant, uh, are having political conversations that change the nature of the concept of citizenry, where it comes to be understood and accepted for the first time that an ordinary part of being a member of a nation is having an informed conversation about the events of the day, informed via the news, via this new medium called the newspaper. And this has a foundational impact on the flourishing of English democracy in that era. This is the very era of the foundation of English democracy. And it comes via, again, not to belabor the point, these slave industries. And so this isn't to say that somebody sitting in the Congo or somebody sitting in Jamaica had the idea, that a black person sitting in the Congo or in Jamaica had the idea of, oh, we're going to change democracy and we're going to install democracy in England. That's not the point at all. The point is that it was the fruit of their labors which made the emergence of this new kind of society possible. Certainly possible on the timeline that we know, right? Who's to say if democracy would have evolved or emerged in England otherwise, had there not been these inputs? Perhaps it would have. We can't really know that. But we can say with confidence that it arose when it arose because of these inputs, which played a very important role and which have been completely ignored in the telling of this story.
One last thing before we wrap up that also has been ignored and has recently been in the news, Haiti. It's in some ways the culmination of this narrative that you trace in your book, the Haitian Revolution, and the abolition of slavery in Haiti by Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian revolutionaries that win their independence from France. And you explain why this isn't just a little local event on a small Caribbean island or half of an island, but actually has world-changing implications, particularly for the United States, and for slavery and the perception of slavery among the enslaved in the United States. So talk a little bit about that, why that event and development is so important in terms of the emergence of the United States as a nascent power, as well as in terms of the institution of slavery within the United States.
Sure, we could have. This is such a fascinating topic. We could have done an entire interview on this subject alone. But I'll just focus on two features of what happened. Right. So Haiti, in addition to, or Saint-Domingue, in addition to being the world's leading source of sugar and coffee, was also a leading source of cotton at precisely the time when cotton was becoming the most important input of the industrial age. In other words, the starting industry of industrialization in England, as we all know, was the textile industry. And the textiles being made in England were cotton textiles. And the cotton was sourced entirely from slave labor. And Haiti was one of the most important sources of that cotton. And so when the Haitian Revolution occurs, ending in 1804 with Haitian independence from France, found that it had to source its cotton elsewhere. And this caused Britain to invest heavily in American cotton, meaning cotton from the United States. And this caused what historians know as a second slavery in the United States. In other words, the first round of slavery, or the first phase of slavery in the United States, was um, focused or centered in places like Virginia, especially in Virginia, and was, depending on the locality, either, for the most part, tobacco or rice slavery. Now cotton becomes tremendously important for the international economy and for British industrialization. And Britain, determined to uh, find substitutes for Haitian cotton, begins to invest heavily in cotton production in the United States. And so you see this very rapid move of cotton, or takeoff of cotton in the United States from that era, precisely from that era, not even vaguely, precisely from that era, right? And this drives uh, the settlement of the United States to the westward expansion of the United States and the settlement of the United States west to the Mississippi by white people, on the one hand, at um, uh, in serious numbers, demographically speaking, for the first time. And then, in concomitantly with that, the transfer or resale of slaves from the the the, the birthplace of American slavery, meaning in the United States, in Virginia and places like North and South Carolina, etc. The resale of those slaves to these new Western territories so that they could be put to work in chains as cotton producers. And so Haiti's liberation by black people, not liberation because the Europeans decided to liberate them, but liberation via their own revolution, begins to influence the evolution of the United States as a polity and as an economy in very powerful and very important ways, straight away. The second thing one has to say is that with France's loss of Haiti, Napoleon's defeat in Haiti, Napoleon having sent the largest flotilla of ships ever in the country's history up until that point in order to put down the revolution of Toussaint Louverture and his colleagues and successors, especially Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Um, uh, uh, Napoleon decided, look, this whole thing about holding territory on the American mainland is folly. I can't do this anymore. I have European ambitions. I need to fight England closer to home. I have ambitions in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. If I want to keep these dreams alive, I have to relinquish my hold on American territory. And so Napoleon sells the Louisiana Purchase to the United States for a pittance because of his defeat in Haiti. And this, overnight, during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, increases the size of the United States exponentially. And then, one could even say, opens the way for the rest of the conquest and acquisition of the Western United States. But it gives the United States, all or part of, I think, from memory, what are now 15 states, um, simply because France lost to the former slaves in Haiti. Um, and so it is by virtue of the Haitians' determination not to live in slavery and to fulfill the most fundamental ideals of the Enlightenment, meaning that we are all born free, that the United States, which makes a religion of the idea of freedom, was able to acquire an enormous amount of its territory and to expand and become a continental nation and to become, by the way, a cotton superpower. Cotton becomes the new sugar. It becomes the most important agricultural product of this new era. And the United States, the figures which I can't reel off from memory, but which I give in great detail in my book, are just astounding. The rate of growth of cotton production in the United States from the 1780s and 90s until the Civil War are astronomical. And this is all the result of slave labor. And this shift in focus in terms of settlement, and exploitation of slavery all resulted from the Haitian Revolution.
Last question before we wrap up. There was a recurring theme in the book, interspersed throughout, where you visit various places that you're telling the history whose history you recount in the book, and you've gone to visit them, and you're looking for some sort of vestiges or traces of this past, this historical past. In some cases, it's a particular plantation or the Elmina's fort. And in some places, there is maybe a very minimal monument or plaque. Often there's absolutely nothing. And I couldn't help as I read the book, it jumped out at me, especially the events of last year, 2020, and the summer, especially the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, whether in the U.S. as well as in the U.K. and France, and the focal point that they often had on monuments or statues of prominent individuals who had been involved in the slave trade, who had profited from the slave trade, who had financed the slave trade, Confederacy generals or political leaders. And that contrast between, on the one hand, a lack of these durable monuments to this legacy of enslavement and this history that you tell in your book, and on the other, all of these monuments that became a focal point and justifiably of all this anger, but yet nonetheless were put up and still often remain. What do you make of that contrast, that distinction, especially in the context of the emphasis you put in your book on the sort of popular conventional history and everything it leaves out?
It's taken a long time to work our way toward a more realistic picture of what slavery has meant for the West and what slavery has meant for the whole world, what slavery has meant for, as I put it in the title of my book, the making of the modern world. I didn't discover this story. I'm just one individual in a bigger picture of people who are working to excavate this history and to make it, to bring it before the public. This is very much belated. I talked about all of the rearguard actions to kind of argue against Eric Williams and to focus on the relatively minor flaws in his argument as a way of wiping out the bigger truths in his argument. So where we are right now is, or where we have come to recently, is a very belated willingness to engage in iconoclasm, the smashing of monuments or the removal of monuments. It doesn't have to be smashing, right? To people who should never have been commemorated in a heroic way in the first place, right? Robert E. Lee and Edward Colston in Britain, in Bristol, or various other figures who were great profiteers from slavery and advocates of the system or systems that slavery created, right? But we have not yet arrived at the moment of anywhere nearly adequately finding ways to commemorate the victims of slavery. It's one thing to smash or remove the statues of the villains, but we have a tremendous amount of work still ahead of us in terms of figuring out a way to incorporate the victims into our memory through public monuments, through memorialization, through narrative, and as I've tried to do with my writing, just through a kind of reinterpretation of history, to show that people who were not necessarily, although there are some world historical figures who deserve commemoralization, to a much greater extent. Toussaint Louverture is a very good example, right? we can't just stop at world historical figures, right? 12.5 million Africans were brought from that continent to survived the transportation from that continent to the New World. Many more millions died not surviving that transportation. And there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to find ways of publicly celebrating their contribution to everything that we enjoy about life today, to everything that has made us prosperous and rich and, yes, democratic and free.
Howard, on that note, it's a fascinating book. I hope and I trust that it will actually play a big role in making that happen. We could have spent the same amount of time on every single chapter in the book. It's really that fascinating and just in depth and full of what for me were just paradigm changing reinterpretations, recoveries of history, and just really change the way that I conceive of this period in history, but also the modern world that grew out of it. So thank you so much for being with us. It was really great talking with you.
Thank you, Judah. You were an early reader, and you remain a very special reader. I really appreciate the attention you've given to the content of the book and having had the chance to have a conversation like this.
That means a lot to me. Thanks again. Howard French's Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, is available for pre-order now and will be published on October 12th. If you've got any questions, comments, or feedback, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him, myself, and World Politics Review on Twitter. And a special thanks to Danielle Toran for assisting with our transcripts. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.